Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Tonight, our guest is Nancy Marlin, PKD patient, how to find a living donor lecturer, member of the OPTN/UNIS Living Donor Committee, speaker, preemptive kidney transplant recipient, and active kidney advocate. Nancy is a professor and provost emerita at San Diego State University. She's a polycystic kidney disease patient. PKD is devastatingly prevalent in her family as her mother passed while she was on dialysis waiting for a kidney transplant. And there's reason to believe that Nancy's grandmother may have also suffered from PKD. Nancy is the eldest of three sisters. Her younger sister had PKD, and her middle sister donated a kidney to the younger sister. Unfortunately, the younger sister passed away due to complications with her immunosuppressive medications. Nancy's kidney function began to decline when she was in her 50s. When her GFR hit 20, she was evaluated and placed on the wait list at Sharp Hospital in the Sharp Healthcare Kidney and Transplant Program in San Diego. She began to experience symptoms at that time like anemia, fatigue, and brain fog, Jim,
Yeah,
because because the average wait time for a kidney transplant at that time was between 7 and 10 years in California. Nancy, after extensive research, made a decision to seek out a living kidney donor. Particularly helpful was our friend Risa Simon's books and Harvey Marzel's website. Risa's been on the broadcast, by the way, 3 times, and she's coming back for a 4th. So everybody keep their seatbelt on. Nancy then began to widely share her need for a living kidney donor. Several friends volunteered to be tested. Eventually, she received a preemptive kidney transplant in 2018. The kidney began working right away, and both Nancy and her donor were doing well after transplant. Nancy was no longer fatigued and went back to work and could travel again. She's had some issues with her native PKD kidney since the transplant that led to a double nephrectomy in 2020. Otherwise, Nancy has been in good health. She has also had a bout of the BK virus and several skin cancers. In addition, she's not been able to generate antibodies as a result of the COVID vaccines and remains at high risk of an infection. Nancy is extremely careful about protecting her gift. Nancy has given back to other kidney patients as a result of her gift by serving on the OPTN Living Donor Committee, the steering committee of TerraPag Transplant Recipients and Immunocompromised Patient Advocacy Group. How do you pronounce that, Nancy?
TRAPAG.
TRAPAG, okay. Each month, she teaches a class at her transplant center on how to find a living donor and has presented at NKF and PKDF events and has volunteered with her local organ procurement organization. Recently, she has become a supporter of the End of Kidney Deaths Act, H.R. 9275, which provides for a refundable tax credit for living donors who give kidneys to strangers who are high on the wait list. Please give a welcome to our friend, Nancy Marlin. Nancy, how are you tonight?
I'm great, and I'm grateful for my transplant. I'm also pleased to be on this side of the screen. I've often been a viewer on the other side of the screen, so it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great, great. Did I state everything correctly in the introduction?
You did, although I don't think I have anything more to say now. You covered so much, but thank you.
Please tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your education, and your employment experiences.
Well, I was born in Queens, New York. I grew up really on the border of Nassau County and Queens. I think I had a rather idyllic kind of childhood. I'm the oldest of 3 sisters. After high school, I went upstate to upstate New York for my undergraduate work. I majored in psychology. I returned to New York for my doctoral work. I have a PhD in experimental psychology. I'm trained as a researcher, not a clinician. When I say I'm a psychologist, people want to tell me they're depressed or about their marital problems, and that's not the type of work I do. My first faculty appointment was at the University of Missouri. And looking back, I can see three very pivotal events that happened during that time. First was the effects of PKD started creeping into my life. My mother reached end stage kidney failure. She was put on dialysis. And as you mentioned, she died a few years later. She was only age 54 while waiting on the wait list. Any loss of a parent is, of course, tragic, but I was only in my 20s at that time. My other younger sisters were obviously even younger. So that was the first time really PKD began to affect me very personally. Then on a more positive note, two other things that happened while I was at Missouri were I met my husband, and also career-wise, I accepted a one-year administrative position, which really changed my trajectory because I stayed in academic administration since then. After Missouri, we moved to the University of Northern Iowa, where I was professor and provost. Provost is like the academic vice president. And then to San Diego State University, where I was also professor and provost. I served as provost for 16 years and then returned to my faculty position and fully retired from the university a little over a year ago, last August 2023.
Okay. In terms of your personal life, are you married?
Yes, this guy I met in Missouri, Fred, he's my husband. We've been married now for 34 years, which I view as quite an accomplishment because I wasn't sure how it would work.
Okay. Do you have any children?
No, no children.
I read an article entitled One Couple, Two Organ Transplants, where you and Fred both had organ transplants at Sharp Memorial Hospital. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
How improbable is that? You meet, people think we met in a transplant support group. But, and Fred isn't someone you would ever anticipate having heart problems. He's thin, he's active, he was an All-American athlete in college, but he developed, idiopathic heart failure, meaning they don't know why, perhaps some virus when he was younger. But it got to the point where he actually needed a transplant. He lived in the Sharp ICU for over 3 months. The Sharp Memorial, as you mentioned, here in San Diego, and he received a transplant in 2017. My kidney transplant was the following year in 2018, also at Sharp. So we are the Sharp transplant couple.
Oh, wow. Let's talk a little bit about your experiences with polycystic kidney disease. When were you first diagnosed?
Well, interestingly, I was tested when I was in my 20s and told I did not have polycystic kidney disease. Now, that was an older technology. I think it was called IVP, basically a contrast with an X-ray that's been replaced, I believe, by CT scans. So I thought, great, I don't have this. But then around 2014, my wonderful primary care physician during a physical was concerned because she could feel my liver below my ribs, and she ordered an ultrasound. Now, as you know, ultrasound technicians are not supposed to tell you anything, but I asked, can you see the cysts on my kidney? Because last time they couldn't. Of course, I didn't mention last time was decades ago with a different technology. But she said, oh, yes, the entire kidneys are covered in cysts. So that's when I knew.
Okay. I understand that other members of your family had PKD or suspected of having PKD. Can you please describe for us what your family experiences have been with polycystic kidney disease?
Yeah, it's been devastating, as you mentioned in the introduction. And as in many cases, because it is genetic, entire families are affected. My mother had PKD, and as I said, died while waiting for a transplant. I have PKD, as did my youngest sister. Now, my middle sister does not have PKD. And when my youngest sister got to the point where she needed dialysis, my middle sister very generously and lovingly was her living donor. And that was in the late 1990s. She was one of the very first to have a laparoscopic nephrectomy. The transplant was a success, but sadly, my sister who received the transplant and therefore was immunosuppressed, developed a very serious lung infection. I think it was fungal. Again, I'm not certain. And as you know, these very serious infections are incredibly difficult when you don't have a fully functioning immune system. So she actually passed away. She was only in her 40s. And then looking back, as you mentioned, I think my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, also had PKD. That makes sense both because of the genetics that she passed it on to my mother. And also she had died of an aneurysm or a stroke. Again, I was young and I'm not sure exactly, but that would be consistent with PKD, even though it wasn't diagnosed at the time.
Okay. Let's talk about your kidney function. I understand that your kidney function began to decline when you were in your late 50s. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened?
Yeah, it started to decline again, not a great deal. But after I had the ultrasound, which confirmed PKD, that would have been in 2014. My primary care person referred me to a nephrologist, and I began seeing the nephrologist regularly to monitor my kidney functioning. I read about what I might do to slow the progression. Many of those things I was already doing. I mean, I'm vegan. I exercised. I was normal weight, and I was on meds to control my blood pressure because, like many with PKD, at that point I was hypertensive. I did start to drink a lot more water, as was advised. And at that, early on, I hoped, oh, maybe my kidney functioning, hadn't started to decline till I was later in life, so maybe I could outlive this. Well, that wasn't to happen. And again, I'm sure as all your listeners know, it's so important if you're in a situation like this to closely monitor your kidney functioning so you know exactly where you are in the process. I actually plotted graphs so I could see, I could predict where it was that I would probably get to needing dialysis or transplant. And I also began to seriously read about transplant and living donation.
Okay. Let's talk about your experiences listing for a kidney transplant. I understand that you were evaluated for a kidney transplant and put on a wait list at Sharp Memorial Hospital in San Diego. And at that time, your GFR was around 20. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, I kept monitoring my GFR, as I mentioned, and once it got to 20, I called the nephrologist's office and requested a referral to Sharp's transplant unit or division, or I don't know what they're called exactly, center, I guess, transplant center. I'm fortunate there are 3 transplant centers here in San Diego, and I had earlier looked at the SRTR data. That's the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, which has all sorts of data about everything, because I was looking for a center that had done living donors that were older. Because I was older, I assumed my donor would be older, although it turned out she was a little bit younger than me. And then based on the data and based on Fred's experience, which had been excellent, that's where I asked to be referred. And I think it's important to note, I was the one who called the nephrologist's office to request the referral. People just shouldn't assume this is going to happen automatically. But the evaluation took some time. It's very intensive, as you know, but I was approved and then listed. I can share one somewhat unusual story that occurred during my evaluation that maybe you've not heard before, although I know you've heard a lot of stories. I was given a chemical stress test, which many people are, where you get a radioactive tracer to examine your heart functioning. The following day, I was in Mexico on university business. We're on the border. We do a lot of work with or collaboration with universities in Mexico. Now, driving back into the US, we're pulled over and put into secondary inspection because we were told we were bringing radioactive material back into the United States.
Oh,
So we were there for quite a while with all these, devices and forms and so forth, as it was determined that I was the source of the radiation from that test I'd had the day before.
oh, wow. That's a new one on me.
Yeah, good. I was going to say, you've heard so many stories. I figured this one you might not have heard.
No, that's brand spanking new. What symptoms were you experiencing at that time that affected your daily life?
The primary symptom for me was extreme fatigue. And I know that's very common for people with impaired kidney functioning, but it's usually not so extreme until the functioning is lower. In fact, my nephrologist did some additional tests to rule out, it must be your thyroids, it must be something else. Your kidneys shouldn't be causing all this at this high level, but indeed it was the kidneys. I was anemic. I could no longer do much exercises. I experienced what you said earlier, the sort of brain fog. It was very difficult to think clearly and to concentrate. And it made daily life pretty challenging. I remember, for example, driving home one day. I was just a few miles from the house, and I thought I might have to pull over because I felt like I kept nodding off, and I might not stay awake till I got home. I had to drop down to working half-time because I could not work full-time any longer. And even with that, I would come home and just fall down flat on the bed without even changing out of my clothes. The fatigue and that feeling of just not feeling well were constant no matter how much I slept, and I was sleeping a lot.
Okay. At the time that we're talking about, approximately how long was the wait time for a kidney transplant in the state of California? I know it's a long wait.
Yeah, it's what you said earlier. I was told the wait time for me to get a deceased kidney would be approximately 7 to 10 years, and that my best option was to find a living donor.
Okay. I understand that about that time you began researching how to find a living kidney donor. Can you tell us a little bit about your search?
Yeah, because like many, again, PKD families, I didn't have anybody who could donate. Although somebody told me, my middle sister who doesn't have it, they said, well, if she really loved you, she'd give you that other kidney too. But I had no one who could donate. And it's really bewildering initially. How would I ever find someone to give me one of their kidneys? I mean, this isn't like asking someone to, drive you to the airport. But I began reading and researching, and there were two sources that I found particularly helpful. Harvey Meisel's Living Kidney Donor Network, and Risa Simon's books that you mentioned earlier. Both were extremely helpful to me. I learned so much from other patients, the two of them particularly, that you don't learn from transplant professionals. And that's why programs like this are so important. And that was all around the time of my diagnosis in 2014 that I'd begun really researching how would I find a living donor.
Okay. I want to remind people that if you go to my Facebook page, my personal Facebook page, pinned at the top of my page is this broadcast. In the comments to the broadcast is all my research, all the links that I found, and the things that were helpful to me in helping put together the broadcast about Nancy. And in those links, you'll find the links to Risa's books and Harvey's website that she's talking about, so you can go and check them out for yourselves, and all of the other things that we're going to discuss tonight. There are links there in those comments, and that includes the End of Kidney Deaths Act which are pinned to the top of those comments. So if you want to drill down and learn a little bit more about what we're talking about, then that's available to you. I understand that when you began to share widely your need for a kidney at that time, that was a little difficult for you. Can you please describe to us some of the steps that you took?
Well, the common theme of everything that I read was to widely share your story. So I worked on and practiced my story. That part wasn't that difficult. I mean, I'm good at writing, I'm good at, I'm used to speaking and so forth. But sharing it is really hard. We don't want to talk about our kidney disease with others. And everyone considers their medical situations to be personal and private. We don't go around telling everyone. So I felt very vulnerable and anxious, and you don't want to be a burden by telling everybody about how you need a donor and so forth. And I kept procrastinating, but I finally did start sharing my story. I never asked anyone to donate. That was, again, based on the advice I had from both Harvey and Reese's writings. And I shared my story about my disease, the long wait time for a deceased donor, and how I was hoping to find a living donor.
Okay. What kind of a response did you get?
Oh, all sorts of responses. Again, this is emotionally very, very difficult for lots of reasons. There were some friends who I talked to, and these are people I'd known for a long time, and I said, oh, surely they're going to want to help. And they would listen and say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Nancy. I hope it all works out. And then they change the subject, and you're sort of devastated.
Uh-oh. Nancy, are you there? Kind of frozen on the screen. Nancy, if you can hear me, you might have to log out and log back in again. Any rate, Nancy was talking to us about sharing her need for a kidney and the responses that people were giving to her. And as you know, that can be a tough thing to do. Someone that's been through a kidney transplant, that it's tough to get your request out there. It's tough to ask people to donate a kidney. It's a surgical procedure. Obviously, they're removing a body part. As you know, recently we talked about the risks to a kidney donor. Now the risk of death is actually less than 1%, but there's still a risk. And recently, I started a new Facebook page about why is it so difficult for someone to donate a kidney. And that's probably Nancy. Where am I at here? All right. So it's doing something. Hopefully she'll be back with us soon. Up on the phone.
There I am. I can't hear you, Jim.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can. Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I had to hang up the phone
Yay.
first.
Oh.
So we were talking about the response that you got to your request for a kidney.
Right. As I was saying, people responded in ways I didn't expect, and there was sometimes really difficult emotionally. I also had people who told me they'd like to help, but they only have one kidney, which is, again, not that uncommon. One of the reasons we know people can live with one kidney. Probably the most surprising response I got from someone, I didn't know her well, but I shared my story. And she said, I'd like to help, but I already donated my kidney. So there's a lot of, a lot of sharing your story, a lot of difficult responses, a lot going on emotionally. But then miraculously, some people did respond, well, what do you have to do to donate? Maybe I could be your donor. And that part is, it's just, it's truly, I think, the best of humanity in caring for others.
Okay. So I understand from what you're telling us, there were ups and downs during the testing process trying to find a matching living donor. Some of it was euphoric when people would agree and disappointed when they were ruled out. Approximately when did this process take place and how long did it take?
Well, again, you're absolutely right. It's both time consuming and emotional. As you said, you've got people who volunteer to be tested. They're immediately ruled out. That's that roller coaster you go through. And there's constant uncertainty and anxiety. You don't know if this is going to work. Now, the friend who was my donor had some situations that required additional consults from others. So it took many months, again, more anxiety, more uncertainty for her evaluation to be completed.
Okay. I understand. Well, I want to say up front, right, that your friend has asked that her name not be spoken, that wishes to remain anonymous. That's
right.
So people understand that's we're not talking about it because we were asked not to talk about it.
Right. No, she again, she wants to remain anonymous because I think, feels she doesn't want people to think what she did was so heroic, although what she did for me was indeed heroic because she restored my health.
Okay. Any rate, I understand that this friend was finally approved to donate a kidney to you. Can you tell us about when that happened?
It was in late 2018. And as I think probably anybody who's been through this process knows, even though there's a lot of waiting, once your donor is approved by the selection committee, they're first sort of approved in terms of their going through the evaluation. Then it goes to the selection committee. And once that's approved, things move very quickly. So once she was approved, went through the selection committee, I got a call from my transplant coordinator to schedule the pre-ops and the transplant, which occurred a few weeks later.
Okay, and this again was in 2018, correct?
She was approved in 2018. The transplant occurred December 10th, 2018. So I'm coming up on 6 years.
Oh, wow. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Now, this was a preemptive kidney transplant. This was a transplant before dialysis. So you received your kidney transplant without first being placed on dialysis. Is that correct?
It is correct, which I was very, very grateful for. Yes, it was preemptive. And so I never had to go on dialysis.
Lucky you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you please describe for us what happened on the day of your transplant?
Well, it's both exciting, but there's still that anxiety because I'd read so much. I knew so much. I'd been reading the medical literature. I'd been reading the patient literature. I knew there were so many things that could still go wrong. There'd be the final cross match. There'd be the grilling my donor. Did she really want to go through with this? Then, of course, you worry, could she have surgical complications? Again, they're so rare, but you start worrying about your donor. Then on top of all those more realistic concerns, I began to dream up things like maybe she'll get in a car accident driving to the transplant center and so forth. But fortunately, all went smoothly. That day, there's a very early check-in. I was admitted to a hospital room where then, as you know, people endlessly ask for your date of birth. My donor went directly to the pre-surgical area. And I waited and waited. And, as time goes by again, you're a little bit anxious. But once the hospital transport people came to take me down to the OR, I was thrilled because I knew they wouldn't be taking me down to the OR to tell me it wasn't going to happen. So I knew I was really getting a kidney.
Okay. Tell us, did your transplanted kidney work right away? What happened?
Yes, I woke up in recovery, and I have to tell you, the fatigue was gone. That fatigue, chronic fatigue I had for so long was gone. Now, I was still groggy, of course, from the general anesthesia. I had some pain from the incision, but I actually felt better than I had in a long time. The kidney functioned immediately and was in there being a great kidney and cleaning everything up. My donor stayed overnight in the hospital, and fortunately, she recovered very quickly. I stayed 3 nights, and my recovery also went very well. I began walking right away. As you know, they get you up in the hospital to walk around, and I built up to quickly. I was walking a couple miles a day, and I think that really helped my recovery. I had the usual frequent blood draws and clinic appointments in the first few weeks, but soon after that, I was back to work. And I think my first international trip for work was 4 months later.
Wow. So both you and your donor recovered quickly, is my understanding. Is that
We
right?
did. We did.
Okay. After your transplant, did you have any kidney-related health issues?
The transplanted kidney was fine. It's been absolutely fine. But my native, so-called native polycystic kidneys were problematic. They were large, and sometimes they thought it was cyst breaking because I would have these pains. And then there was concern about infection. So I was recommended to have an MRI every 4 months to check, particularly that there was no cancer in these complex cysts. Well, I decided that did not sound like a good plan. So I had them removed. I had a laparoscopic bilateral nephrectomy in February 2020, which, if you recall, was not a particularly good time to be in a hospital. COVID was just emerging. And that recovery was actually more difficult than my transplant. I also had about a BK virus, as you mentioned earlier. Fortunately, that resolved quickly once they just reduced my immunosuppressants a bit. I've had some skin cancers. I see the dermatologist every 4 months. The primary problem I have, you referred to earlier, was being so heavily immunosuppressed. I take belatacept, which it's not tacrolimus or other calcineurin inhibitors, which should be better for the kidney long term, but it's such an effective immunosuppressant that my immune system doesn't generate any antibodies to COVID vaccines and probably to other vaccines. So I've been very, very cautious not to become infected, which has meant restricting a lot of activities, but I want to do everything possible to protect this precious kidney.
How would you describe your current health condition?
Great. I feel great. After 6 years, my creatinine's still 0.8, and my blood pressure normalized immediately post-transplant. I was off my blood pressure meds, right in the hospital.
What is your current feeling about receiving a kidney transplant?
Oh, just extraordinary gratitude. I mean, I feel I'm extremely blessed.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your advocacy work and your efforts to give back to the kidney community since the time of your transplant. Talk to us about serving on the OPTN Living Donor Committee. What is it that the committee does, and how are you contributing to that?
Well, my advocacy work really began out of gratitude. It's an effort, once you've been given this amazing gift, you want to help others. And I learned so much. It's a complicated process, as you know. So I wanted to share with others what I learned. And then one thing kind of leads to another. how I got involved with that committee was the class I teach, this How to Find a Living Donor class. One time I was on the OPTN website because I was looking for some data that I was using in my class. And there's this big button that said volunteer. And I was like, volunteer for what? But it was for the committee structure of OPTN. So I filled out my application. I didn't actually think about it for some time. And then I got a call about appointing me to this committee. The Living Donor Committee, right now, one of our big projects, which I think is so important, is we want to have lifelong tracking of the health of transplant donors. Because right now, as you know, there's the policy is you're supposed to follow up on them at 6, 12, and 24 months. Well, potential donors want to know, of course, what happens long term, not just with the first 2 years. So there'll be a proposal that's coming out that OPTN would really partner with SRTR, as I mentioned a moment ago, the data people, to track these people long term. So we would really have a much better idea of what happens. We'd also have an accurate control group because, of course, people have health problems as they age. And how much of this is attributable to donation, if any, and how much is not? So who's a control group? And so what we're hoping is the people who are approved to donate but don't donate for some reason, that the recipient got a deceased donor or another donor, something like that, they'd be the perfect control group because we know they're healthy enough in the same way as the people who donate, and then we could track them. So this is a project I'm pretty excited about, and I hope it will come to fruition.
Okay. Talk to us a little bit about serving on the steering committee of the Transplant Recipients and Immunocompromised Patient Advocacy Group.
Well, this is a group that really came out of the Johns Hopkins studies. Early on, this is early in COVID, Johns Hopkins recruited transplant recipients because they were justifiably concerned that we would not necessarily respond adequately to the vaccines because we often don't. And of course, at that point, the CDC was saying, oh, you got your series of 2, you're fine to go. Well, of course, that wasn't true with transplant patients. So it was the Johns Hopkins data that showed that. So one time, Johns Hopkins was doing a webinar on their results. And of course, everybody's in the chat worried about this and that. We didn't have good direction. And then someone, her name is Janet Handel, decided we needed a Facebook group to actually start talking with one another and sharing accurate information. And the Facebook group is called the Transplant Vaccine Study Group. And it's still very active. It has, 2.3 thousand members or something like that. But through that is an advocacy group. That's the group you just mentioned. And there are 6 of us in the steering committee. And we've been pretty busy. We meet with federal agencies, we meet with pharmaceutical companies, we meet with researchers, all advocating on the part of the immunocompromised who, in a lot of these ways, with the pandemic, have been left behind because we're still very vulnerable and at high risk.
Okay. You mentioned that you have been teaching a course at your transplant center monthly on how to find a living kidney donor. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I had worked with Harvey Meisel early on, and he did these workshops, these in-person workshops on how to find a living, or how to have your donor find you. That's his phrase. And he trained me, and I was starting to work with him, and then COVID hit. So there were no longer any in-person workshops. Harvey went a different direction. He developed an excellent set of videos that really encompassed what he had been teaching. I went in the direction of small group interactive classes, and I did these online. I still do them every month with my transplant center. These are for patients who are generally on or about to be on the wait list. And I go through some basics about, just the sort of basic education about living donation. But then the part of the course that I think is most valuable is I have them actually work on their story. They have to actually write it and say it. And I think that's critically important because you can't just be passive and watch videos and read about this process. You have to be active. So getting them to actually say their story is a big step because people are, again, they don't want to talk about this. And just talking about it, even with this small group of strangers, is a big step. So that's what I'm emphasizing. And I also, as you've already heard a little bit, I emphasize the emotional aspects. People, I think, underestimate how difficult this is. They really, I'm trying to get people to anticipate, you're going to feel this way. And then anticipate it. I try and validate it. It's really hard to do this, and then normalize it. We all felt this way. You just got to get through those emotions and just keep going, because the way you find a donor is you have to widely share your story. So that class has been going on, and at least from the feedback I get from students, it's or the students, I'm so used to the university, the patients. They say at the end, I've been really hesitant to do this, but now I think I'm going to, or now I have a clear pathway of what I'm supposed to do. And also, they often mention it means so much coming from me as a patient, not just hearing this from transplant professionals. I can say I had to do this. I'm not asking you to do anything I didn't do. And hearing my experience, I think, from a patient point of view, really is helpful.
Okay. I saw a video that you did for the PKD Foundation on how to find a living donor. And I understand that you did some presenting for the NKF and the PKD Foundation. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I had reached out at one point about this, how to find a living donor, to both PKD and NKF. And as a result, I was invited by the Polycystic Kidney Foundation to present at one of their conferences. This was a very similar approach to what I teach, but it lacked that interactive part. And that, I think, is the key, because people, again, could just watch it. They didn't have to say anything or do anything, because you couldn't really do that. I only had 30 minutes or something, and a large audience. So I think you saw what I do, but that's not the heart of it, because the heart of it is getting them to give their story, giving them feedback. And it really becomes almost a group thing. They all, they'll laugh with each other. They'll cry with, some of them do cry with each other. So it's not the heart of what I'm trying to do. And then with National Kidney Foundation, I've been invited. They have a set series of programs, First Step to Transplant and things like that. So I've been one of the both a presenter of a section, I believe, several times, and then they have a patient panel to talk about their experiences.
Wonderful. Wonderful. You mentioned that you did some volunteer work for your local OPO, organ procurement organization. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's Life Sharing is my local OPO, and they often want presenters of transplants to go and talk about organ donation. So I've done that both in the high schools. This was pre-COVID, because I won't go in high schools now. Germs, all those germy kids. But this is the time when they're getting their driver's license. And in California, that's one of the questions. Do you want to be an organ donor? And they get the pink dot on your driver's license. So they have, a CAN type of presentation to talk about the importance of organ donation and give examples and so forth. So I've done that. But then more recently, what I've done for them, they do presentations to various groups. For example, nurses continuing ed, to talk about transplant. I've talked to first responder groups. Probably one of the most interesting is they had me talk to a surgical staff at one of the local hospitals. And they were really excited, because they said, we always see the organs go out, when there's a deceased donor, but we never see them come back. What happens? Even though I explained I was a living donor, they were really pleased to see me, and they just had a lot of questions. So yes, I've done a lot of those presentations.
Okay. Let's talk about your support of the End of Kidney Deaths Act, GR 9275.
It's
Can you
HR,
start?
HR,
HR.
House Resolution. Yeah.
Shame on you, Uncle Jim. There'll be a new Uncle Jim in the morning. Can you start by explaining why you think the act is needed? Why is it necessary?
Well, I think the U.S. can probably justifiably claim to have the best transplant system in the world. Nevertheless, there are really significant changes that are needed because it's failing so many. We all know there are thousands dying on the wait list each year. They're dying while they were waiting for that call for the transplant center that never came. And then in addition to those people who actually die while they're on the wait list, there are thousands who are removed from the wait list each year because dialysis is so debilitating. It often causes serious, effects like heart problems. So even though these people were healthy enough when they were put on the wait list, that is, they went through their evaluation, they were deemed to be healthy enough. After a few years, they may not be healthy enough any longer, and they're removed from the list. And it's absolutely tragic that someone could have waited on dialysis for years, thinking they're getting closer and closer to receiving a transplant, only be told they're no longer healthy enough for a transplant and they're being taken off the wait list. So the underlying problem to all of this is a shortage of donated kidneys. It's supply and demand. There's such a shortage relative to the demand, that long wait list of people on the kidney wait list. So on the deceased donor side, there are some important reforms underway with ambitious goals. And of course, we all hope those are successful and increase the number of deceased donors. But even if they are successful, there still won't be nearly enough organs to address the severe shortage of kidneys. That's why I think we need reforms on the living donor side. And as we know, living donation is the best option, especially because a kidney from a living donor lasts longer, which not only, of course, helps the individual recipient, but it ultimately reduces the wait list because fewer people are getting relisted because their kidneys last longer. And also compared to deceased donation, the number of potential living donors is not limited to people who die under very specific circumstances, as is the case for deceased donors. So, in my own advocacy work and in the class I teach, it's just beyond heartbreaking to see people suffering and dying when their deaths are preventable. This is needless if we could only have more kidneys available. So the End Kidneys Deaths Act is a proposed solution. It's a 10-year pilot to financially incentivize living donation to strangers. If someone is interested and approved for donation, they would donate their kidney to a patient at the top of the wait list. Then, as an incentive, they would receive a $10,000 refundable tax credit for the next 5 years. And the NKDA, the End Kidneys Death Act, would also have the benefit of substantial taxpayer savings because right now, billions, with a B, billions, are being spent on dialysis.
Okay. Wouldn't this just be a way to allow people to sell organs? Is that a problem?
Well, Jim, I must admit that when my first reaction when I heard about this, which I suspect is the case for many, is this whole idea is rather off-putting. It sounds like, somehow rich people might be exploiting poor people who are desperate enough to sell their organs. But although I was uncomfortable with it initially, I kept reading and thinking about it, and I eventually switched to being a supporter because I think the proposed legislation has reasonable safeguards. It's not a get-rich-quick scheme. As you know, there's nothing quick about transplant. The person who's interested would first have to undergo the same rigorous evaluation that any potential donor undergoes. And that means probably a lot of them would not even qualify. They'll be disqualified, as happens with many donors right now. If they are approved, they would donate their kidney, again, to someone near the top of the wait list. Then the following year, there would be a tax credit. So, of course, there's always a class difference. How much does $50,000 mean to a particular individual? It means more to a person who's lower class than very, very wealthy. But I think $50,000, the $10,000 over 5 years, again, it's not immediate, it's over 5 years, would be viewed as a comparatively large sum for most people and hopefully would attract interest. But that's exactly what the study is going to determine.
Okay. Are there polls or other data about whether or not people would support such legislation?
Well, I don't know of polls, but there have been some very well done survey. There's some very well done survey research. I'm thinking of one research article in which people were given different scenarios about paying for kidneys. And the most unpopular idea, the one people didn't like, was having the recipient pay the donor in cash. Clearly, people don't want sort of a free market for kidneys. But the greatest support was for an agency giving donors a cash equivalent, such as a tax credit, and the level of support increased based on the number of transplants that would result. So I think it's important to do this act, again, as a pilot study to see how many additional transplants would occur. I don't think we can continue to hold on to this unrealistic notion that altruistic donors should just donate out of the goodness of their hearts. I mean, a few hundred wonderful, wonderful people do this every year, but that's not enough. We need some innovation. We need some bold new approaches so that we don't continue to have so many people dying for lack of a kidney.
So what do we have, 12, 13 people every day that pass away on the wait list?
That's on the wait list. And then again, you have the people who were taken off the wait list, and they're probably dying too. So it's so needless. That's the whole thing. These people were healthy enough when they got put on the wait list. And it's that wait, the dialysis and so forth, that has made it that they're no longer healthy and they're dying. So this would allow them, we hope, to get a kidney much faster because there'd be more kidneys available.
Okay. Do you have any future advocacy events that you can talk to us about that are coming up?
Well, I actually feel like I'm pretty busy now. But, I did just get invited to the AST, American Association Transplantation Community of Practice on Living Donors is doing a sort of invited conference for different segments of people on improving kidney exchanges, the paired exchanges. So I'll be joining that. I think that's not till next February, but yeah, that's one thing coming up.
Okay. I always want to ask this question of my guests in case I forgot something or there's something that they wanted to discuss. Do you have any final statements that you wish to make to our audience tonight before we conclude the broadcast?
Well, I don't think you've omitted anything. You're very thorough. But I think my statement, and hopefully you can see this through my talk, in medical situations related to transplant, you cannot be passive. That is, there are some situations you probably can be passive and get good medical care. Others make medical decisions for you. You can't be passive with transplant from the very beginning. Be active, know your labs, know if you're listed. I'm always taken aback when I'm talking to people in this class, and I always ask, "Are you listed?" They're like, "Well, I'm not sure." You know, that you have to understand these things. You should know if you're listed. You should know if you're in an active or inactive status. And then, of course, you must be very active to find your living donor. And I hope maybe people listening to this broadcast might consider being active in advocacy and supporting the End Kidneys Death Act.
Okay. Wow, Nancy, what a lot of ground we covered tonight, and so much terrific information about how to find a living donor and your experiences. And I'm very, very sure that we've raised a lot of awareness tonight that was not previously there. And I just want to thank you very much for coming on and sharing your story with us and talking to us about some of these very difficult issues, how to ask people to help
Mhm.
you, to donate, to
Yeah.
ask them to share your request and things of that nature. Just a wonderful job you did. I just want to tell you how much I really appreciate you taking time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate being here. And as I say, I learned so much from patients, and you make that possible. I mean, I fortunately have gotten into this network of these wonderful advocates. I mean, I started with Harvey, and then one of the presentations I gave, Risa Simon, who had been my hero from her books, contacted me because she was in the audience. I got to know her a bit. In fact, I heard a rumor that she's going to interview you. Is that true?
That's true.
Wow.
Yeah,
Well,
in a couple of weeks, sometime in November, Risa somehow thinks that I'm under interviewed, which is not true between you and me. But she wanted to have a broadcast where instead of me asking her questions about her kidney story,
yeah.
she wants to ask me questions. And
Oh,
I agreed
good.
to that. So I think it's the second or third Friday in November that we're
All
doing
right.
this before
I know
Thanksgiving.
a lot of people who watch this will want to turn in for that to hear your kidney story.
Well, that should be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to it. And there's nobody quite like Risa Simon to probe your kidney story,
Right.
So
But there is this wonderful grassroots of advocates. And again, you're one of the superstars,
yeah.
and you know them, everybody, because you've interviewed everyone.
Well, we try. Over 300 broadcasts so far.
Well,
In my experience, so we do try to get around. Um, Again, I appreciate very much your coming on. I have some things to go over with the folks. We're going to talk about what's coming up next week, and you're free to go. I've kept you for almost an hour, and wow, it was just terrific, Nancy. I thank you so much for taking time to talk to us tonight.
you're very welcome. Take care, Jim.
All right, you too. Thank you again, and I look forward to trying to answer Risa's questions. All right, everybody, that's our broadcast for tonight. Next week, our guest is Pesh Patel. He's a two-time kidney transplant recipient. He's a very, very active kidney advocate. He has his own website. He has his own podcast. Everything that he does is directed to trying to help kidney patients. Should be just a dynamite interview. Looking forward to it. So you hang in there until next week. And as my friend Kent Bressler always says, keep breathing, my friends. We'll talk soon.